Hello everyone. So I have a very specific set of intentions in mind for today's video. The topic at hand is when witchcraft feels frustrating and messy. When things don't feel or look witchy, glittering or magical, when it is difficult to amalgamate one's understanding of what feels, for lack of a better colloquial term, the most Instagram worthy versus what feels like process versus what feels like just straight up irritation, what feels like it's just straight up not working. I wanted to show that, at least for me, the end result, say, of one of my magical workings or my day-to-day more folk-based practices and so on, might be perfectly in line with what I hoped for. It might be really effectual. It might end up working out just right, but that does not mean that the process itself didn't have really irritating and annoying hiccups along the way. It does not mean that the entire process itself looked like magic. I particularly want to highlight this, in a way that is hopefully quite separate and severed from what we can term toxic positivity, because while I think there is merit in seeing any given moment of frustration as a learning experience, as anyone who plays an instrument or practices something to a really high technical level, they will know that often your time periods of the most frustration are actually the time periods of best growth, where what you're doing actually is leveling up and you can perceive that. But I also just wanted to show that, like, frustration is frustration some days, and that those things, maybe from almost a shadow work perspective, if people understand what I mean by that term, they coexist. So on the days where I'm a frustrated lump, I'm just a frustrated lump, because that's what I am some days. I am equally that as when I am my most glittering, as I said in a recent video, Ice Queen self, which is a little bit what I'm trying to channel today. So, what I'm hoping to achieve with this video is show some of my magical workings in process, without, compromising them. They're already done. Show some of my magical workings in process, but show some of the moments where it looks a little less whatever I think I look like, if you know what I mean. Moments where I get flustered about something and a little bit pink in the face, so I actually decided in this case of scenarios to, like, turn on the camera and troubleshoot that. Moments where I'm facing a quandary and I'm not really sure how I want to proceed, so I'm working through that. Moments even just of scattered thinking, without making the video itself, this video, too boring. I wanted to show also components of craft that are nowhere near, that happen nowhere near the altar. All of these are still indoors in my home, but hopefully the thing I'm going to be communicating, the understanding, is that these things can also happen in this way out and about. I often, pretty much every video, will remind people that I'm an autistic person. So when I'm out and about and I'm out in the world, as someone who is incredibly reclusive, I need a sense of magical working to be able to navigate certain types of scenarios, especially ones that involve unexpected things. So anyway, this video is going to show footage of some of my sewing projects, where what I'm trying to do is work that magic into the process. And I am also going to discuss spatial management, not only in terms of decor, but of my sensory environment as part of my sense of magic, and also elements of when the frustration just doesn't work. This is going to involve showing tarot cards and oracle cards, and some discussion of things like glamour magic and visuals, as always. Yeah, so hopefully for anyone who's interested, I think that having a video like this on my channel as well will be really, really useful. It's not the kind of vulnerability I maybe want to show all the time, because I am very much into the whole like, ooh, artsy space and glitter and that's kind of my jam. But maybe having a video on the platform that serves as a little bit of a reminder that at all times, you know, one is still, as I was at one point when trying to troubleshoot something that I'm not going to show on camera, one is still really tired and nearing meltdown, and also possibly rather hungover, you know? So, yeah, hopefully, as I say, like all the time, I can edit this into something that makes sense. So, what I was just trying to do was use some of my frustration today as an opportunity to learn something about my machine. I'm basically trying to learn how to listen to it better, listen to her better. You know, as I have shown on the channel before, she is a hand crank fiddle-based singer-sewing machine from 1888. I have given her the use name of Bridget at this time. And one of the things about these sort of like hand crank machines and so on, these hand powered machines, is that you can actually hear really, really intensely, like when something doesn't sound quite right. But what I'm trying to do at the moment is like, I guess, get used to some of the smaller nuances of those sounds. Like I can hear when something's off, but hearing exactly what is off is something that I want to get a bit more of an intuitive sense of, and a bit more of an immediate ability to respond. But as I think you will see in some of the footage, you know, it was a bit of a fluctuating thing, and what I was trying to do is listen to hear when that was becoming an issue, to see if I could discern by ear when there were tension issues. Of course, at a certain point my bobbin thread ran out, which is not something you necessarily hear. And that always happens to me right when the end is nigh, like when I can see the end of a project in sight. And I suppose the good thing about that is, like, normally the most I'll do, you know, device-wise, computer-wise, and so on, internet-wise, while sewing, is listen to podcasts or usually watch crafting or sewing videos, just so it feels like I'm crafting with someone. But it's a really nice exercise in actually turning off all of that and just paying attention to where you are, and really getting a sense for what your machine is telling you, because the other option occasionally is to break a needle. Now, I do have lots of spares, but and I don't use antique needles because obviously they're very hard to come by, especially for this model. They're very expensive. But, you know, I'd rather not like churn through them, because I also run the risk of damaging the machine if I don't pay attention. And I like that attention to detail component of this old machine, in addition to the satisfaction of sewing, you know, without electricity in my machinery, in addition to the satisfaction of the sort of antique vibes, you know, all of the ways in which one would imagine it's really satisfying to sew with an antique machine. I'm also like here and up for the challenge, as it were, and up for like the challenge not just physically or skill-wise, but also in terms of like learning to think differently or listen for different things. Even when that feels really frustrating on an afternoon where I'm a bit crampy and a bit headachy and a bit flushed and a bit like so near the end of a project that I kind of just want to stop caring. But like maybe that's part of the deal, is that like, you know, it ain't over till it's over. Pay attention, focus, learn something. This is important. You could damage your machine otherwise. Like, this is important stuff. Anyway, I'm rambling now, so that's all for now. So one thing I want to cover in this kind of framing device footage right now is that One of the rooms, the room I'm currently sitting in my apartment, has had been irritating me quite a bit lately. And I wanted to figure out what I could do about it. The decor in the room had always been really, really intensely mismatched. Too many reds of all different sorts of shades and varied tones, and it's a room that lighting wise can be quite difficult and tricky for me, both in terms of the sensory experience, but also just in terms of figuring out like how to make things more visible or stand out as and when I wanted them to. It was all number of awkward things, right? I did film a good portion of this process, but I'm a little uncomfortable with showing it. And part of that is because I, as I indicated earlier, was super hungover. I was also really, really swollen and crampy, which is not something, like menstrual cramps, which is not something that's supposed to happen to me anymore. So when it does flare up, it's genuinely part of like a health problem. So I was struggling with that. And I had also, as I discussed in that footage, which I won't be showing, as I said, I had also just finished trying to clean a bunch, because what I wanted to do prior to trying to do this particular magical working was get everything really, really clean, and then I did basically an incense cleanse. So I had just finished hoovering, which is literally my least favorite activity ever. It's necessary, so I do it, but it usually runs the risk of meltdown for me. I'm really clumsy. My sense of spatial awareness is not great. My sense of depth perception, especially with my hands and my feet, is terrible, or like where my head is in space. I'm the sort of person who, even if I'm not near an object, if I bend over to reach something, I'll knock my head on something on the way back up, that kind of thing. So hoovering is really, really difficult for me, especially with things like back injuries and so on. So I didn't film the hoovering process, which maybe you guys are glad about, but I had also been cleaning and washing the dishes and so on. And I had been working magic into those processes, particularly while washing the dishes, because in our apartment we don't have a dishwasher. I wash dishes by hand. We wash dishes by hand. I was singing trad songs about household chores, counting songs, songs about lazy people who don't take part in the chores. Like, I narrate some of that experience to myself and I make it a bit more collective so I don't feel so bored and so alone or whatever. You know, it creates an element of interest in that process for me. So I was working magic through all of these things, but certainly by the time I turned on the camera, I was uncomfortable. And really, honestly, looking at the footage and trying to edit it was an exercise in, shall we say, accepting the shadowy parts of the self and recognizing that on days when I feel like that, and to an extent look like that, that's still me. I had a real sort of talk with myself about whether or not I wanted to share that footage, but I still maintain that there is a little bit of a divide between the personal and the collective in terms of what I post online. And while the purpose of this video is to show some of that messy component, the purpose of this video is also just to serve as a reminder that even in a situation where I'm showing a little bit more of the process, a little bit more of the mess, I am presenting a little bit more of a curated, shall we say, artistic persona online. I am myself authentically, as I often say, but I am not, like, you know, I'm a really, really, really intensely reclusive person. So I don't leave the house if I do not have the ability to curate my physical sensory experience, which includes my appearance. And certainly an element of vulnerability on this channel is important to me. An element of authenticity in that vulnerability is important to me. But I still have, I've realized, I mean, I knew this anyway, but I still have an element of, okay, I'll do the shadow work about that myself, and perhaps someday I'll be more comfortable with this. But for now, I'm not at that stage in the process. I'm more at the, holy crap, I've just looked at footage of myself and I just need to sit with that for a while. However, I also want to acknowledge that I was really proud of what I was talking about in that footage, so I'm going to discuss that here with you. What I did was, once I got the incense going and had the room kind of smoke cleansed, it smelled great. I love it. It was my favorite incense. I decided that what I needed to do was draw some tarot cards to help me address the space around me. I will show before footage of the space, which unfortunately had to be filmed using my tablet camera because another thing that was happening a lot was camera troubles. So I will show before footage, and then you will get also after footage. I'm currently sitting in some of the after. But basically, you know, there's a beveled window structure in this room. The light comes only from one side of the room. In Ireland, the light tends to be really cold and gray and bright during most of the day. And then occasionally you'll get these flashes of really intense gold as the sun comes in at a really low angle. What that tends to produce for me is a struggle with visibility, but also a struggle to understand how to navigate the different moods of a room throughout the day. And that's something that's really quite important for me if I'm going to actually sit in and occupy my own rooms. I was also dealing with, you know, I live in a not great environmental, personal environment kind of situation where some of the infrastructural issues in Ireland around the housing crisis and so on do play a role in this space, play a role in the kind of relationship that we have with our landlord, that kind of stuff. I'm working with, like these couches, for example, are provided by our landlord and non-negotiably present, unfortunately. I hate them. So, you know, there are various things like that where I'm like just sitting there going, I can't seem to make this room work. There's too many of a hodgepodge of my own things in this room, none of which seem to be talking to each other. And for some reason, I've over and over again tried to redecorate this room and have had a really hard time thinking that through. So I was like, all right, I need tarot's and oracle's help. So I grabbed the Margaret Petersen tarot, the Lonely Dreamer tarot, and the Luminescent Oracle by our very own Lennon Smith. I had actually not recently worked much with the Margaret Petersen, and I felt that this was a really great opportunity to make use of the deck. One of the personal connections I was making in this case was that this deck, the Margaret Petersen, reminds me really, really strongly of how I visually picture the Earthsea world in Ursula K. Le Guin's The Earthsea Chronicles, Chronicles of Earthsea, which anyone who's been on my channel for a little bit longer, I haven't mentioned it recently, but they're my favorite books. Le Guin is one of my favorite authors, although I'm not someone who tends to, like, when I have a favorite musician or author, I don't listen to all of their stuff. I just know that of what they've produced that I like the most. I have a huge amount of Le Guin in this house, though, in this apartment. Anyway, the cards of this deck remind me very distinctly of elements of the dry land, of some of the discussion around you know, existential elements of like how we define ourselves, you know, binding versus unbinding, any number of things, death positivity, embodiment, balance, the meaning of concepts, the meaning of tradition, the meaning of gender roles, all that kind of stuff. And this room is the room in which we house most of our fantasy, sci-fi material, our folkloric collection of books and stories, our fairy tale collections, and to some extent also our nature guides, you know, species identification nature guides, and our poetry mostly about nature. So it felt really relevant to bring Margaret Petersen to bear on this room. Furthermore, the color palette of Margaret Petersen is much more wide-ranged and variegated, so I felt it might help me to have potential for a really varied color palette to come up in a way that might help me field work some of my troubles in here. I also liked the fact that the borders of my Margaret Petersen are kind of maroon, because, for example, the carpet we have in here is like a maroon color that I struggle with. It's not the same shade as the borders of this deck, but it was like a little cheeky nod. The first card that I drew, actually reversed, but I'm going to show it up right here, was the Hierophant. And what you get here is a very stark divide down the center line of this image of dark into light or light into dark. There's an element of warmth and fire as well. One of the things we do in this room at night, because the electric lighting situation in this apartment leaves a lot to be desired, and we are going to be working on that soon. One of the things we do in this room at night is function largely by candlelight, in a way that's really, really cozy, in a way that brings a lot of warmth into the scenario. And so it reminded me that I wanted whatever I came up with in this room to function in candlelight as well as in broad daylight, as well as in electric lighting. It reminded me that part of the reason I struggle with electric lighting is that it creates a kind of a sickly wan yellow color that to me is highly unnatural. I can best characterize that color of light as like depressive thinking. Like that's what it makes me think of every time. Like you give me that kind of weird evening yellow light that's really, really unnatural, and I will just not be able to think right. The balance of the light and dark in this image as well made me in that moment literally realize, oh, every time I've tried to organize this room, to glamour magic this room so that I feel comfortable in it, I've always forgotten to acknowledge that if all of the light comes from these large windows in this really intensely like right in the face kind of white way, then it doesn't make sense to overburden that side of the room with decor. It makes sense to place things where they can be illuminated by that light and then just make sure that there's a sense of balance elsewhere. And another thing that I considered with regard to this card in terms of actually being the Hierophant is that a huge part of the world that I come from, my family of origin and so on, is rooted in an awareness not only of art history, but of historical elements and also modern elements, like the technique that goes into home decor is a thing that many of my family members have cared about. I have furniture in this room, for example, that was given to me after my aunt passed. It belonged to her. So there's an element of tradition, both on the family level that was relevant, but then I also realized in terms of art historical technique, color balance, color theory, modern art practice, it's something that I needed to think through much more analytically in consultation with the wisdom of the ages in this room, in a way that I think I wasn't doing properly before. I was kind of just going, ugh, I want a vague, cozy thing, and I wasn't formulating like a better informed, rooted in, best practice, as it were, kind of techniques. The next card that I pulled from this deck was the Ace of Flames. It was again reversed, so I'm going to show it up right here. Reversals, I've spoken about this before on the channel. Reversals for me do not mean opposites. Most often they tend to kind of equate to an emphasis of meaning, but that's not totally how I read them either, so I'm going to leave that conversation out for now, because I'll talk to you about what I got out of the reading. So I got the Ace of Flames. What I really liked about this, firstly, is that this emphasis of gold as an almost, it is a framing device, reminded me of medieval icons, iconographic techniques, this sense of gold leaf. And as I'm sure anyone who watches this channel knows, I'm really a fan of using elements of especially gold kind of shimmering highlight, and considering how and when light and the quality of light interacts with that to create either warmth or to create spots of illumination, to balance out other darker things. And furthermore, this color palette wise re-emphasized to me that warm tones are kind of the rule of the day. As I think is pretty clear in my own personal taste, I do prefer a lot of warm tones, warm colors, especially actually as juxtaposed against darker, a balance of dark versus warm tones. That kind of, again, my whole recent Halloween ritual was in fact black and gold, rooted in black and gold. And for me, this also talked to me about, you know, the fact that the furniture I do have control over, I do tend to be very, very, very dark. So what I started to get out of these was, where is your sense of light coming from? What type of qualities of light are you playing with? What are you expecting to have in this space? Where do you want to place your points of darkness? Also a sense, which I'll get to in a minute, of don't overburden that. Think about technique, think about tradition, think about religious symbolism. So the next card that I got, I drew from the Lonely Dreamer Tarot. So I got the Five of Swords from the Lonely Dreamer Tarot. Was the next card. And what you'll notice here that stood out to me straight away was this light component, as if coming through the windows casts everything else completely in shadow, basically just silhouettes. Really, really obscures a lot of the image. You have to really look and dig for the information here. And that is something that is a recurring issue in this apartment. You'll notice in a lot of my videos that when light suddenly shines in through the window, I get exceptionally squinty, because this effectively is what I'm experiencing on the regular. Furthermore, I found the Five of Swords component here very, very interesting. So I made reference earlier to the housing crisis in Ireland. That has really intense and far-reaching collective effects, individual effects on people. Homelessness is a rampant problem here. And one of the ongoing or further on from that kind of effects it has is that for those of us who are fortunate enough to have housing in Ireland, we have very little rights as tenants. Landlords have a huge amount of control. They are rarely held up to their own contractual obligations. And there's really very little legal recourse for that kind of thing here. A lot of people are living in exceptionally poor conditions in this country, but also being charged a huge amount for it, for example. We are in some ways very fortunate with this apartment, but in terms of it, you know, what amount of room we have and so on. But suffice it to say, the place is structurally not the most sound. This room in particular has had repeated structural issues. I was telling a friend the other day that a couple years ago, when I was going through a really difficult time with a few external things, we had a simultaneous problem. It never rains, but it pours. We had simultaneous problems with literal mushrooms bursting through the walls and growing in our bathroom. And I'm like, look, I'm all about toadstools and fairies and things like that outside the living space. Fortunately, we no longer have actual fungi bursting through and like little mushroom caps in our bathroom. That's been resolved. But like, you know, again, it's one of those things where it's pulling teeth to get a landlord to acknowledge a very egregious problem, and like you're lucky if you even get that far, and you get to pay for the privilege. Woohoo, you know. So I often get very Five of Swords in my head when what I'm trying to do is exert a sense of autonomy over what I can influence in my space. You know, there's the capacity in that way that you sometimes do when you think of someone you knew years ago who pissed you off, and you just start arguing with them in your head as if you'd ever be able to talk to them ever again. That kind of vibe. I can get very ranty, very Five of Swords, very like, I need to win, but I'm also gonna like insist on the winning being all about the things I basically have no control over. It's a cop-out, and it's something that I'm very guilty of in terms of getting very frustrated, very anxious, very, very exacerbated, very exhausted a lot of the time. So in addition to this talking to me about some of the visual things I needed to consider, it was also talking to me about some of the ways in which I self-sabotage mentally. That I'm really rubbish at dealing with. It was a bit of a call out in a way, you know, a gentle-ish one. I mean, weirdly enough, the Lonely Dreamer Tarot isn't always the most gentle, which is part of what I like about it. But this was a really, really useful card. I was pretty surprised. The next card that I got, therefore, was interesting as well. I got the Two of Pentacles. Now, here we have a return of those warm tones. That sense of healthier, natural lighting. We have a figure that is exerting some sense of bodily autonomy and balance. They are navigating a lot of things, balancing something, walking downhill. There's the sort of stormy-ish sea, turbulent waters in the background. I actually do really like this kind of slate blue as juxtaposed against these colors. That talked to me a bit about some of the trouble I have in navigating warm versus cool light or a grayish kind of light. But it was also about, you know, especially in conjunction with these other cards where we have the Hierophant being the wisdom of the ages, the Ace of Flames being the beginning of the process, a sense perhaps of ambition, but understanding that it's going to take a while to get there. You know, this is an aspiration that needs continued development. The Hierophant helps that development. The Five of Swords reminds me that there are still things to be balanced internally as part of this process. And then when you take these four cards together, just hold them up here, you start to get a really interesting set of color palette considerations, you know? So I really liked that they're, you know, continuing some of these sort of fiery, warm-toned themes, but telling me about how that manifests physically, the effects that has physically, the kind of balancing act that that requires, and the sort of meeting oneself where one is. There's a reciprocity about that as well. So the last thing I'll mention is that I pulled an Oracle card as well from the Luminescent Oracle, which is just... I don't mention it very much on this channel because actually I don't mention a lot of my decks on this channel. I'm kind of working with them all the time and it doesn't always occur to me to like talk about everything. Surprise, surprise, I know because I talk a lot. But anyway, I got Manifestation out of the Luminescent Oracle and I, in my original footage, kind of lost my mind. I was all like, ooh, oh my God, because this actually spoke to me about a couple different things. One of the great things about this deck is that, as I think people maybe do or don't know, it is functioning out of a chiaroscuro-based tradition, which is the tail end and then following the Renaissance, characterized by that really, really strong contrast, chiaroscuro, between a light source and shadow. Lennon has taken details from various paintings and put them across all her cards and or put them in her cards and then added these amazing keywords. Like her keywords in some cases really blow my mind and make me rethink things, and it's something that makes everything in the deck, even including the figures and the cards and so on, something you can interface with and really talk to and dialogue with and ask questions of and just sort of sit with even. It's almost like sitting of an evening by candlelight sewing, for example. There's a real interiority about the deck, not only in terms of your spatial awareness around you, interiority at night, for example, or whatever, but there's an interiority of the person, the ego, the persona, the holistic, like the unified whole, shadow, soul, maybe even. It's a really, really interesting, useful, potent deck, in my opinion. So this manifestation card really caught my attention. There's an interiority here. There is an element of that passing on of knowledge and technique, intergenerational components, ancestral components, which is very relevant to this room decoration process. And furthermore, I really appreciated this emphasis on actual crafts, actual things being accomplished here. In the before and after footage, you will notice a couple of things. Actually, one of them is behind me now. That elements of things that I have made myself are part of the decor in this room. Some of my art projects are hanging up on the walls. My fairy wings are now hanging up on the walls. This is a guardian doll for this room. A lot of my own witchy doll making work is house guardian oriented. I have former Samhain work in this room. I also have the artwork of former family members in this room. There's also art that I have gathered from experiences as I've grown up. This painting, which you can't really see right now, but this painting behind me is of a mountain scene. It is actually by a very famous Argentinian artist. I did not have to pay for this painting because a neighbor near where I was growing up was getting rid of it out of their basement and clearly didn't know what it was. I didn't know at the time either. I just loved it. I've had certain really formative experiences in the mountains growing up repeatedly. So when I was a teenager, I didn't know about pathworking. I didn't, identify as a witch or anything at the time. But when I was a teenager, I used to sit in front of this painting and just go to the mountains. I could feel the wind on my face. It was just a really, really important sacred experience for me. So it's important to me that I have this painting at all times. On the wall over there, which you will see in a minute, I have sort of a fox shrine area because I'm obsessed with foxes. There's a lot of fox stuff all over this apartment. But one of the pieces there is a print from an artist who lives in Dartmoor in Devon, from when I went there on pilgrimage. And I also have, for example, artwork done by my niece. I have a bunch of nieces and nephews, all of whom are incredibly interesting, creative, intelligent, curious, unique, beautiful people. And my niece, this niece in particular, is extremely artistically inclined. Really, really beautiful, interesting stuff. And a beautiful, interesting thinker. And this is a piece that she did for me that I commissioned from her a few years ago when she, like pre-pandemic, I think, where she was, I think she was like about 12 at the time. So she's, in her teens now. But she made it up a fox because I told her, just paint whatever you want. I will love it either way. And she painted something that I don't think she even knew how much it meant. I'm going to get emotional thinking about it because oh my God, it's also the cutest thing on the face of the planet. So, the point is that there's elements of craft, like the physical activities of people I love, like either me or people I love in this room. But there's also, for example, a pair of shoe lasts in here, which, hint, hint, is something I'm hoping to work on soon. So they're not actually just ornamental. So the manifestation thing here, I also, I have an issue with some of the throw pillows in this place, and I want to actually make my own quilted pillows using my own discarded waste materials from my fabric projects as stuffing, as I often do with my poppets. So there's a whole lot of this hands-on craft, interiority kind of thing going on with this concept of manifestation. All while I'm sitting on the couch struggling to decorate this room, struggling to understand how to manifest my space, how to bring my ideas to bear on my lived reality, while my face was all pink and I'm all sweaty and hungover and crampy and swollen AF. So again, I'm not showing that discussion footage. I've given you the discussion here instead, but I am going to show you therefore the before and after. And I think what's particularly interesting is you will see how the color palette that I got here very much informs how I approached decorating the room. This arguably is what the room ended up looking like. And the last thing I'll just say about that is that that's part of what I mean when I say curating one's collection of cards. To me, it's almost never a what are the chances of this happening, showing up kind of scenario. The reason, among other reasons, that tarot and oracle work for me is because curation isn't just about what will I buy or bring in. It's why. It's what resources does it take to achieve that? At what pace will I be achieving that? But it's also about the limitations of your collecting remit. What are you working with? And what is the value add? The monetary value, especially in the language of curation and material management and so on, information intake, it is not the only form of value. There is a material value, there's evidentiary value, all sorts of things. So what you end up asking yourself, it's less about what decks you collect, in my head anyway, with curation. And it's more about what are the narratives I'm interested in creating at various points, especially for someone like me who, in addition to doing readings, uses their cards in a magical practitioner kind of perspective for actual workings. using the exact same materials, the exact same raw materials or exact same possessions. Curation is about saying one story versus another, but with the understanding that whichever one you choose, you can manifest with the same materials. It's about creating and spinning that narrative. There's an element of glamour magic to it. So what you end up getting with your collection of decks is a reflection of your own tastes, which then have a reflexive, responsive relationship to how you relate to your world around you. So it's a little bit of I suppose in a way, a bit of a feedback loop, because the color palette that is likely to show up in your decks is likely to then also feel highly relevant to the way you want to move through the world. And then the way you move through the world influences what you bring in terms of your decks. But for me, that's also why it is not always appropriate to bring things in. Or when I do bring things in, and especially as it has incidentally happened recently, a lot of things come in all at once, even if you've been planning for them for months, just things happen to coincide such that they all arrive at the same time. The reason that contributes to overwhelm is because the sense of pacing that is part of curation, at least for me, gets a little bit wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey. And that is something that I then need to take the time to kind of sit down and mitigate and navigate. And for me, that plus things like the sewing, plus things like formulating the intention for clothing, plus doing the dishes, plus, like all of these things which happen not to be at the altar are all the process of what magic is and feels like. Singing folk songs while doing it is what the process of magic feels like. And like I said, having the days where I'm hungover and feeling shitty as fuck, looking shitty as fuck, losing sense of my, sentences on camera because I'm trying really hard to get at something I can't get at, blah, 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 blah. And then having the cards help me out through that process. Like, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with this video, sort of. Again, with a little bit of guarding my own privacy going on and my own vulnerability. So hopefully that made sense. And hopefully people derive some value from this video. And I hope I also haven't bored you all to tears. Do bear in mind that no one is obligated to kind of stay in this space. I'm aware it's on the niche-ish side. I'm aware. So I hope everyone is doing well, taking care of themselves to the best of their ability and being kind. And I will see you all next time. Bye.